This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 187 of the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. I regularly hear from therapists who ask me questions about how to evaluate language in a way that gives detailed, meaningful, and accurate information. Most people know standardized tests only show a fraction of what we need to know when it comes to language and cognition, yet many clinicians still don't consistently utilize a complete portfolio evaluation. A lot of barriers get in the way, including lack of clarity on what dynamic assessment means, misconceptions about how a robust protocol looks, and a little hint, robust doesn't always mean standardized, pressure from leadership who want to see standard scores, or confusing and outdated guidelines that don't enable clinicians to effectively evaluate diverse populations. That's why I invited Destiny Johnson to episode 187 to talk about dynamic assessment for monolingual and multilingual learners. Destiny Johnson is a bilingual speech-language pathologist with a deep passion for culturally responsive assessment and treatment practices, as well as advocating for policy change. She has presented on dynamic assessment at the CISHA Convergence 2024, focusing on the importance of dynamic assessment in bilingual children. Destiny has experience working as a school-based SLP in private practice and in early intervention. She is also the founder and CEO of Multimodal Communication Speech Clinic, PC. In this conversation, Destiny shares key concepts relating to dynamic assessments, including modifiability and assessing learner potential, using graduated prompting and test-retest to make treatment recommendations, the mediated learning observation sheet, and other tools that make dynamic assessment robust without relying solely on standard scores. What is examiner effort, and how do we use this concept to put explicit supports in place? Do school leaders really want standard scores, or is it something else they need? Be sure to check the show notes because Destiny mentions a ton of really great resources that you can use to learn more about dynamic assessment. And also check the show notes to learn more about where you can connect with her. Also, there's still time to get 25% off when you join the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations as part of the National Literacy Month campaign. Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program that gives speech pathologists and other professionals working on language a framework for language therapy. To learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. The School of Clinical Leadership is my program that helps related service providers put executive functioning support in place on their school teams using multiple service delivery models. So we cover direct intervention as well as how to coach and consult others to ensure that students are getting support across their day. To learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership, go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And to get 25% off, all you need to do is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page. And finally, if you are already a member of either program and you refer a friend, I will set you up with a $100 referral bonus. All you need to do to get that referral bonus is let your friend know that they should email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com and let me know that you referred them, and I will set you up with that bonus. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Destiny Johnson. Today, I am joined by Destiny Johnson, a bilingual speech language pathologist. So, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this topic. We're going to get into dynamic assessment today. It's something I've talked about before and I'm asked about constantly. So, I'm really interested to hear your take on things because I know you have a lot of great experience in this area. So, I think the best place to start would be tell us a little bit about yourself, your history and then the work that you're doing now.
So I've been in SLP since 2019, and it was in my first year that I conducted a dynamic assessment, and all that was with the support of my CF mentor. So in that moment is when I realized the true power and clinical utility of this assessment method. I've have experience in the schools. Right now, I'm working in a school district in Los Angeles County. I also had experience working in a district in Illinois. And in that time, I was able to learn a lot more about how to integrate a dynamic assessment within my overall assessment procedures when I would assess children who were bilingual. And at that time, it was a unique situation due to COVID. So a lot of the kids, when they were returning back to school for in-person learning, they had experienced some unique things because of the fact that a lot of them were not attending school, did not have that consistent learning. So in that moment, I knew that perhaps it wasn't appropriate to rely on a norm reference instrument. So it was in that moment that I began to implement the dynamic assessment and learn more about it. And I continue to learn more about it. And it's a very fascinating assessment procedure, and there's so much more to learn about it.
Yeah, so I love it's first of all, I can't believe COVID was that long ago. Like it's 2004. It feels like it was a few months ago. So that's I was just thinking it makes me feel old. But anyways, so yeah, a lot of things that you said there about because I just remember my diagnostic course when I was going through grad school, and it really was about administering tests, which of course you need to know how to administer tests. I remember the first time that I had to get a basal and a ceiling in my a diagnostic in graduate school, and I did it wrong, and the clinician had to come in and help me. So obviously we need to know we have to understand all the psychometric properties and all of that. But like when I'm asked about assessments, people usually mean, what are the tests? Give me the list of tests. And I'm often hesitant to give the list of tests because I know that they're just going to do the test and they're not going to do the other things. And so sometimes I'm like, hold on, let's pause a minute here before we get to the list of tests. Let's make sure we really understand this. So um yeah, I have so many questions for you, but I think one thing I wanted to point out is that you bring this unique perspective being a bilingual SLP, but you can use this even if you're not bilingual for monolingual students. So, I mean, it's so wanted to just make that point before we start here, but it's even more important for students who speak multiple languages. So, that's my soapbox before we get started. But yeah, I guess maybe let's start off by let's define what we mean when we talk about dynamic assessment, because there's a lot of words floating around like informal, norm referenced, formal, and what are we actually talking about?
So dynamic assessment, it's very unique because of what we are looking for and what is at its core. So
Mm-hmm.
we are not taking into account any of the previous experience that the child had, because we know that children have had varied linguistic experiences. So a norm reference instrument is not able to really account for all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, what we are really looking at is change over time within our intervention session,
Mm-hmm.
because in a dynamic assessment, you are implementing a teaching session
Mm-hmm.
rather than just performing a test. Yes, you are providing a pre-test to post-test, but within there, you are teaching using the mediated learning experience, which has been advised to integrate, and you are looking at a child's learning potential. So you want to see how much change you were able to induce within that short period of time, and also how well that child is able to integrate the strategies that you have taught them in order to learn that skill.
I love that you point that out because that is another reason why I often start with the framework or the intervention. Because if you have an intervention, that can be part of your assessment in your data collection, not just your ongoing data collection, but also the assessment. So what are some, I'd love to hear about the mediated learning experience and maybe some examples of skills that you could use, or maybe even just side by side. How would this look in a norm referenced assessment, and how would it look in a dynamic assessment? And maybe you're doing both. Like maybe there's value to doing both. Maybe you really need to lean more towards the dynamic assessment. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So when you have a norm reference instrument available and you are using it and the child is responding in a certain way, and based on your clinical judgment, you determine that perhaps this child would be able to learn this skill in a short period of time, this is where the dynamic assessment can really come in, because perhaps the child got the question wrong because of the way it was asked, because of testing anxiety, perhaps of the fact that they never got exposed to that concept, or they didn't have the strategies, they never learned the strategies in order to acquire that skill. So this is where that dynamic assessment is coming in, where you are teaching that specific language target during your intervention, during that mediated learning experience. And here you are documenting how the child is responding to their learning. So in order for a mediated learning experience to be considered one, there has to be components that you are integrating within that. So there has to be meaning, transcendence, competence, and mediation. So these are the components that are really important in that. And the mediated learning experience was not meant to be standardized because of the fact that it is highly influenced by how the child is responding. And it's a very interactive approach. And what I have noticed in my clinical experience, that this is really where you are able to see a child's true abilities because of the fact that you are engaging more in an interaction rather than in a testing format.
Yeah, I love that. And that's the other thing where people sometimes, even when I'm doing training for clinicians, it's like I had one person say, people really like it when you tell them step by step what to do for the entire session. I mean, how can I do that when I don't know how the student's going to respond? But you can give a framework and examples of how you could scaffold or teach. But then there needs to be some flexibility in how you deliver that. So I know that there's probably tons of examples that you could give, but I do want to make sure that we link people to some resources for some specifics. Do you have go-to things that you've used to learn about? So you said those three components were, again, it was
intentionality, meaning, transcendence, and competence.
okay. Was that 4? Did I count that
Yes.
wrong?
No,
It's 4.
it's
Okay.
okay.
So there's 4. Okay. So so learning that those are, again, we're starting high level, and then I'm sure there's some descriptions of some specific frameworks, and then maybe even examples of how you might use specific language targets like vocabulary and syntax, or whatever it is you're trying to mediate. So what are some tools that you've used to learn about this process where people could like learn some specific examples?
So I leaned a lot on the research, and thankfully, a lot of the research was initially conducted by Dr. Pena, and she continues to conduct research on dynamic assessment. And in her initial studies, in the appendix, she would provide a script that they utilize in the research study where they are integrating the mediated learning experience. And this is where I was able to see how this is implemented in clinical practice, and I adapted it to those language targets, because ultimately, as long as you are integrating those components in order to encourage the child to engage more in their learning, to take charge of their learning, then this is what is defined as a true mediated learning experience. And this is where we can really truly see their learning potential. So I was able to look at the research articles, and also Dr. Patterson is also another professor who does a lot of research on dynamic assessment, specifically on narratives and using graduated prompting procedures, which is another form of dynamic assessment that is currently being studied more on, because I primarily use a test, teach, retest approach. And Asha, at this time, there is still a free webinar that you can look at on dynamic assessment that is conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Peña. And this is where she goes over how you can integrate the mediated learning experience in your clinical practice based on whatever language target you have chosen.
So I wrote that down. We'll definitely link to that because I think people will really like to see those examples. And I think one of the other things too is that that you can do this for the broader, higher level structural things like narratives. You could also do it somewhere really specific at the word and the sentence level. So I like that there's a mix there. And I think that sometimes people get in their therapy, people kind of err towards either super structured drill and kill, or so broad that it's a little like it seems almost too loose to be rigorous enough for an assessment, which sometimes it is okay to be less structured in therapy, but we do need to be more structured in an assessment process, but not so rigid that we're focusing on this standard score and we have to follow this script the whole time, because then we're not being responsive to the student. So we'll definitely link to those things, but I would love to speak to, or like talk a little bit about, all right, so let's say that you've learned, you've done the research and you've got this protocol that you're going to follow. So I guess two questions. How do you prepare for the assessment? And I have a couple ideas about how I might do it, but then also, let's say after you've done this process and you've had a mediated learning experience with a student, what would you do as far as documentation in your report? Because I know that's something people stress about. We don't have the standard scores, and my administrator is not gonna, think that the student qualifies because their self 5 score was too high or whatever. So yeah, maybe talk about the documentation first, and then we can talk about the learning.
And it's really important that you state the fact that administrators feel very comfortable with the score. And I was very aware of this because after COVID, when I implemented my first dynamic assessment, I moved to Illinois, and it was a new state for me. So administrators were very wary of the fact that, okay, what's the score? Did the child qualify or not? So thankfully, I stumbled upon the mediated learning observation sheet, which you are able to measure the child's responses during the mediated learning experience. So it provides a little bit more of structure of how you are reporting the child's performance. So in my dynamic assessment, in the reports, when I was reporting on the dynamic assessment, I began to cite a lot of the research articles because of the fact that I needed to support my evidence and support the procedure that I was using, which was very new for the administrators at the district I was working at. So I would report the score. So for example, responsivity was one of the components in the mediated learning observation scale. And I would talk about how the child performed. I would provide qualitative information on my report, and then I would have a summary as to putting everything together. And based on all of this, based on their pre-test to post-test score change, as well as their performance within the teaching session, I can conclude that, yes, this child has high modifiability, or this child has low modifiability and would need a lot more support, because ultimately administrators want to know, well, what does this mean? And that's where the dynamic assessment can really come in, because ultimately we are there to determine, okay, does this child have a language impairment, and does it necessitate us to step in and provide more specialized intervention? So within the information that I was able to obtain from that dynamic assessment was able to help me and help the team and determine this child will need a lot more support, a lot more intervention, because based on that mediated learning experience, they were not able to use the strategies effectively. And these are things that need to be reported on the report to justify perhaps why the child may need to be pulled out for speech and language services.
So there's some different vocabulary, it sounds like, surrounding dynamic assessment. We've got, instead of scaled scores and standard scores, we're talking about things like modifiability. So what are some terms? I guess that one I would definitely love to hear more about, but are there some other ones that we should talk about too? Modifiability, anything else that are kind of key things that you want to pull out in your report?
We also have learning potential as well.
Okay.
How well they responded, examiner effort, was it high or low examiner effort? Because if there was a lot of examiner effort that was utilized during that dynamic assessment, then we know, okay, this child might need a little bit more support, which would perhaps warrant speech and language services. So we have examiner support. And then we also should describe the type of dynamic assessment that was performed, because there is a difference between graduated prompting or test and teach retest procedure. So you definitely want to specify on your report which procedure was used. And then also you would want to report on your pre to post test scores. So for example, I like to use a narrative language measures during my dynamic assessment, and I provide a table of this is how the child performed at their pre-test, and then this is how the child performed at post-test once the mediated learning experience was conducted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like, I mean, again, like I said, like a whole new vocabulary. So we have, instead of listing out your subtests, so you said modifiability, learning potential, examiner effort, graduated prompting, test retest. I'm sure you said a few more in there, but I know that some of the resources that we'll link to will probably have those. Is that in the webinar with Dr. Pena? Does she go through some of these things?
Yes. And if you are using the mediated learning observation scoring sheet, it's a Likert scale of 1 through 5. So you're looking at cognitive arousal, cognitive elaboration, as well as internal and external social emotional. So you're looking at each component, and when you're done with each mediated learning experience, you should complete that form right away so that you can rate how the child performed. And these are the results that you are reporting. And that scale has been validated already for children kindergarten until 2nd grade. And based on the study that they did using this scale, they determined that a lot of children with language impairments received certain scores. So the lower scores, so probably at the range of 1 to 2, in comparison to kids with typical language skills, receive scores within the 3 to 5 scale. So you would report these scores within your report, and then you would also provide qualitative information of how the child performed.
I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy by focusing on the essential components of vocabulary that help students develop a foundation to support strategic planning, to support high-level processing, and to give them those vocabulary and syntactic skills they need that are going to support literacy and life outcomes. As a clinician, especially if you are in the schools, it can be really difficult to know where to start. In fact, that's probably the biggest pain point that I hear from school SLPs is, where the heck do I start? What is my hierarchy? How can I prioritize all these possible skills when my students have so many different needs and I have so many different people telling me all these different messages about where I should be focusing? What I do in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is give you a 5-component framework that supports those language skills that are going to build the foundation that students need to support their academic skills, their vocational skills, their reading and writing skills, all those things that are going to help them be successful in school and in life beyond school. That 5-component framework focuses on vocabulary as the core umbrella area where we are supporting students. And the elements that fit under that umbrella are orthography, morphology, phonology, semantics, and syntax. So we're building a foundation for students to have that high-level processing, to be able to understand sentences at the word level, at the sentence level, and to be able to formulate complex thoughts for high-level strategic planning. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. I really like the Likert scale, and I think that I get a lot of questions. There's the language side and there's the executive functioning side, which is, I would say the executive functioning is even more difficult to measure than language because, yeah, that one, there's the similar issues, but it just becomes even more complex. But I think that the rating scales, particularly the Likert scales, are a nice middle ground where we have made things a little bit more objective and tangible so that we can communicate to people what's happening here and again organize it, and then also provide qualitative information. And maybe in some cases, if it's appropriate, you also might have norm referenced assessments depending on what you're looking at. But here we've got multiple sources of information, and it's kind of making everybody happy. Like, you've got the qualitative information so you know what to do in therapy. Because I mean, that's really the issue with a lot of these norm referenced tests. People just write their goals based on the subtest, which you're not really supposed to do. I think a lot of people know you're not supposed to do that, but people still do it, but they don't really know what else to do. So yeah, I like that as a kind of a middle ground or another tool to kind of bolster the not the argument, but like the case that you're building for this student about why they need services. Because I think, I know people love to hate evals because they're very time consuming, like not the eval, but the report writing. But really what it is a communication tool about this is what this student needs. So it's actually very important. So I think those kind of things, again, the Likert scales, especially if they've been validated, are very helpful. I have one that I use that I just made up, and I'm very clear that it's not standardized, and that it's like, this is a communication tool. It's not a norm referenced assessment, but that's great that there is one that has been validated by research. And I also love that you're citing research in your reports, because I don't think people do that very often, and we probably could make a case for students who are, again, we're not really getting what we need from the norm reference test, and they're not qualifying, but maybe they need support.
Correct. Yes. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because teachers are, when you're collaborating with teachers in the assessment process, this is where a lot of the data that you're getting in your mediated learning experience can really help you collaborate with the teacher to determine, is this the kind of support that you are able to provide in your classroom setting? And this is something that I did and that I have been doing. So for example, if I assess a child and I know that they needed frequent breaks and you needed repetition of the question in order for them to be successful, because based on that mediated learning experience, those were the kind of accommodations that we were providing, I would then collaborate with the teacher and to determine, okay, is this an accommodation that could be provided within your classroom setting? And this is something that not necessarily we would need to pull him out, because once giving these strategies and these accommodations, he's going to perform well, and he's not demonstrating characteristics of a child with a developmental language disorder.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that it gives teachers, and everybody else that we're working with, more to work with. And I think that is really the part of the issue with the norm referenced is we're not pulling the right information, and then we're not communicating the right information either. It's like it's not always effectively identifying the right students. And then if we do identify students, it does identify some, but then it's okay, what do we do now? What do we do for this student? So I would, again, I think we've hit on some of the issues, but what are some misconceptions that you have seen, maybe from clinicians or from leadership or just in general, about dynamic assessment as far as its utility or what it actually is?
So I think the first misconception that I see most of the time is that you are comparing the child to their peers in a dynamic assessment. And that's really not what's happening. You're comparing the child to themselves and you're looking at their change within that intervention to see how much change was I able to induce and how much examiner effort did I have to implement. Also, how well were they able to learn this strategy? So you're in this very moment, you are not comparing a child to their peers. So that's one of the first misconception. And then the second one is the fact that it has to be standardized. And that's not it. It does not have to be standardized. And I think there has been a back and forth debate about this as to whether we should standardize a dynamic assessment, for example, the mediated learning experience, and not necessarily. As long as you are integrating those components that we talked about, then that is what is considered a mediated learning experience. And you are making sure that you are being flexible with how the child is responding. So those are the two first misconceptions that I primarily hear from others.
Yeah, I think the distinction between comparing to peers versus comparing to yourself. I mean, it's an important one because really it sets you up for therapy as well because you want to be able to measure progress. And that's also a challenge as well, because that's the other question I get all the time is, what do I do for my data collection? And if your evaluation does not set you up to be able to take data in a way that is meaningful, then that's a problem. And just the idea that these are two separate things, because again, like in many situations, if you're using only standardized test, and I'm, not making a blanket statement that all standardized tests are bad, because there are some that are very good. But if that's only what you're using, then when you try to transfer this over to goals, it becomes very difficult. And I think, even if you do have you're using a test like I think the TILS is a really good assessment for language. So even if you're using a very robust assessment like that, you could still be in your evaluation protocol also using that to do some dynamic assessment. Maybe not when you're in the middle of administering it, but then you look back and say, okay, where are some opportunities where I could do some mediated learning based on how they responded to this formal test? Because that's what I sometimes recommend people do, is like, maybe you start with your standardized assessment for situations where it's appropriate, but then where do you go from there? You get this information, how do you branch out from there? And one place could be doing dynamic assessment. So yeah. And I think the other thing is the idea of standardization and how useful it is, because I think that what school administrators really want is scalability, not necessarily standardization. Like, does that distinction make a difference to you? Like, we want things to be consistent, and scalability and being consistent isn't the same thing as standardizing.
Right, right, which is where those mediated learning observation skills really come into play, as well as ensuring that you are following the framework of a mediated learning experience. So I definitely agree with that. And I forgot to mention one more of the misconception, and this was a mistake that I made as a first-year clinician, is I really leaned a lot on the pre-test to post-test change. So I would compare that. However, that's not really what we should be leaning on. We should primarily put a lot more attention on the mediation, the child's modifiability during your teaching session, because that is really where we're going to get the bulk of our information. And based on our clinical judgment, this is where we're going to be able to determine, okay, is this child going to need a lot more support? Are they demonstrating characteristics of a child with a language disorder?
So really what you just mentioned, the modifiability. So it's about what did you do and how did the student respond to it? But really that can bolster the pre-test, post-test, and that it's all right, here's the scores, like here's the measurable change before and after, but here's what happened in order to create that change.
Correct. Yes. So that because of, for example, if you do see some change, we really want to know, well, how much examiner effort was involved in being able to induce this change? And that's really important information, because we know that a child with a language disorder versus a child with typical language development is going to respond very differently during that mediated learning experience. So that's why it's so important that we are documenting and obtaining really good qualitative data during that teaching session.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think what you said, that the response to intervention, or the response to the change, is really what can be a good diagnostic indicator. Is that something else that is discussed in the research that we've mentioned so far, or so we can actually look at how would a student that doesn't have a language disorder respond versus how would a student that does?
Yes. So, for example, a child with a language disorder, most likely you will need to give them a lot of examiner effort. They will have really a lot of difficulty utilizing those strategies effectively on their own. They would continue to need your support. Those are two of the main points in comparison to a child with typical language skills. You would be able to fade out your support because they have quickly picked up a lot of the strategies that you have taught them, and you're not going to need as much examiner effort. So you would be able to clearly see there the difference, because we know when a child has a language disorder, they're going to need a lot more intervention, a lot more direct support. So that is what we're seeing. That's what we should be seeing during our mediated learning experience.
I think the big thing there that teachers and probably administrators as well need to see is, one, that this additional effort is needed, because a lot of times there's this idea of, well, kids should just pick this up. Just showing that yes, some students need things to be more explicit. And just because this group of students over here picked it up on their own doesn't mean that you don't have to use more effort to teach another group of students. But then also documenting that when you do put that effort in place, that there can be a change, that you can influence these skills and these students can make progress. And there's your case for why they need the intervention or even additional supports in the classroom or at home or wherever it is, wherever it is you're talking about, all the other environments there.
Correct, because ultimately what we would want and what we should be able to do is assisting the child in being successful during the mediated learning experience. That's what we want. So we want to make sure that we are providing with these strategies that are going to support them, because then that can help us then plan for intervention. So yes, I definitely agree with you. And that's one of also the advantages of integrating the dynamic assessment as well, in contrast to just relying on a norm reference instrument.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, advocacy and what we can do to make help spread the word about the value of dynamic assessment. But one thing that I know is on everyone's mind is, how am I going to find time to learn about this? And then how am I going to find time, once I have learned about this, to do a good dynamic assessment and find time to write the report? So yeah, I think that those are probably the biggest barriers. So there's the buy-in and then the time and the skills. So yeah, how have you learned to navigate all of those things?
So the way that I have navigated, because I have received some pushback, is continuing to integrate more of a convergent evidence within my assessment practices. So not fully relying on a dynamic assessment, and we shouldn't, but continuing to utilize that norm reference instrument and other alternative assessment procedures, and as well as bringing in that dynamic assessment and also reporting on those scores from that mediated learning observation scale. And also continuing to educate others on federal and state policy at this time, federal and state law, because as a matter of fact, IDEA does not require the use of a standardized test. You don't have to report a score in order to determine whether a child has a language impairment. Now, I know it varies by state, but in California, we have 3 eligibility pathways, and one of them, which is the third one, being that you are able to use an alternative assessment if the norm reference instruments are invalid, perhaps because a child does not fit the normative sample within that standardized test. And you also have other options there where you could use the standardized test, but I think it'll be important to look at your state regulation to determine, okay, am I able to also integrate a dynamic assessment? Am I also able to advocate at the state level for change on the regulations on how to assess and how to determine if this child has a speech or language impairment?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely important to know what the procedures and what the policies say because, and this isn't a knock on administrators, but a lot of people don't have a special ed background and the language can be really confusing. So if they don't have a special ed background, you might have to pull out those policies and talk about them because there's this idea, again, this is how we do things around here, or how you interpret the laws. Like even we have state, we have federal, but then we have local as well, that districts come up with their own policies. So if the policies are more stringent than the state guidelines, then maybe they need to update their policies, which I know which can be a lengthy process, but if students are not getting services, it might be needed, especially if there's no legal mandates, supporting those policies.
Correct. And I think it's also perception and attitude towards what really constitutes or what is necessary for us to be able to diagnose or determine that a child has a speech or language impairment. And there is a misconception that we do need a standardized score, and that's really not the case. So I think it really is up to the clinician to educate and advocate and to demonstrate you don't necessarily need a standardized score, because if you are using variety of assessment tools and converging evidence, then you can pull from each source and look at whether this child is demonstrating those clinical markers that are consistent of a child with a language impairment. It's not necessarily the standardized score, because ultimately as well, we are utilizing our clinical judgment, our training as clinicians to determine whether this score is really reflective of a child's true potential.
Yeah, absolutely. So one more question before we wrap up, and I have had a conversation with another clinician. I can't remember the episode title, but I will link to it. And it is how to do multilingual evaluations as a monolingual therapist with Meg Morgan. And she did talk about the time factor, which is a huge barrier and an objection, and just a challenge for clinicians to get started, because a lot of times they feel like they don't have time to do all of this. And one point that she made that I thought was really good was, well, what about all the time that you spend, again, going back and forth all the time with all these evaluations, if you don't just kind of put the stake in the ground and really set some expectations about what an appropriate evaluation is with your administration. So there's that. But then also, what is the time commitment if you either miss a student who needs intervention, like the time spent just by the staff, maybe you or other people, or if someone qualifies for therapy that maybe shouldn't, like just the the value of the time commitment up front to do the evaluation, that you actually could save more time in the long run, even if it does take you a little bit longer to do the evaluation. But I'm wondering if, as you get better at it, you might get more efficient. So what are some strategies that you've used and to work through the time factor?
So immediate learning experience shouldn't really last that long. It should be no more than 30 minutes. So it is the fact that you have to integrate it more and more. You have to practice it to feel a lot more comfortable, and you're going to start to see the distinction there. Okay, this is how a child would perform if they have a language disorder, and this is how a child would perform if they have typical language. I also do have when I started, I had a template of a script that I would use. Now, I would not follow that script word by word initially, but it was more so a guide. And the more you practice it, you begin to really learn how to integrate these components in your teaching session. There's a lot of also available products that you can integrate within your dynamic assessment. For example, if I'm doing one on narratives, I use a lot of wordless picture books. Story Champs has great narratives that are very balanced that you can use for your pre-test and your post-test, as well as your teaching session. So that has been helpful for me. So it really has been practice and consulting with other colleagues, and as well as being able to look at right now the ASHA learning paths on dynamic assessment. That has been really helpful for me as well.
Well, we'll definitely link to all of those because this is definitely and it's an important topic. I think people need to learn more about it. And I really do think that when people learn how to do it, it will feel less scary. It won't be as time consuming because we will get more efficient. It's always going to take you longer the first time that you do something. So, and again, I think it is a good investment of time. And there's also the investment of time with the advocacy side as well, which is also a worthy effort. So where can people go to learn more about how to connect with you and learn more about some of the work that you're doing?
So I have a professional Instagram page where I love to share information on dynamic assessment and also performing other multilingual assessments. So you can follow me at Destiny Johnson SLP on Instagram. And I'm also on LinkedIn if you search for Destiny Brooke Johnson, and my company website, which is www.multimodalcommunication.org.
All right. Well, we'll link to all of those and as well as some of the other things that you mentioned in this episode. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links where you can go to learn about all of the great resources that we mentioned in this episode, as well as where you can go to learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs and other professionals working on language to create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about the program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. As always, thank you so much for listening. It helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you found this useful, please feel free to share it with your friends or colleagues. If you are interested in being a guest, if you would like to invite me to be a guest on your show, or if you have a suggestion for a guest, please send me an email at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.